Renville County, Minnesota, August 1879. The air was thick with the scent of cut hay and the drone of late summer insects, but on the gentle rise overlooking the Minnesota River Valley, another sound cut through the stillness, the rhythmic thud of an axe biting into green wood. The man swinging the axe was Ulrich Holzer, and he was doing something that made no sense. He was hewing massive 12 by 12 rafters, timbers thick enough to support a cathedral. But he had no walls. He worked within the footprint of a ruin, a quartet of silent 5-foot-thick limestone walls that rose 8 feet from the prairie soil. They were the last remnant of the old powder magazine from Fort Ridgely, abandoned by the War Department a dozen years prior. To the other settlers scratching a life from the black dirt, the ruin was a landmark, a pile of useless government stone. To Ulrich Holzer, it was the beginning of a home. That afternoon, 2 riders approached, their horses kicking up puffs of dust. The man in front, Theron Marston, the settlement land agent, wore a coat despite the heat, a mark of his official station. His face was set in a mask of stern impatience. The man beside him, a farmer named Silas Putnam, whose claim bordered the old fort lands, looked on with a kind of pitying curiosity. Marston reined in his horse, looking down at Holzer's work, then at the formidable stone walls. "Holzer," he called out, his voice carrying the clipped authority of a man used to settling disputes with a signature. "I've been down to the land office in New Ulm. You need to stop this." Ulrich paused, his axe resting on a half-finished rafter. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He said nothing. "This is not your claim," Marston continued, gesturing with a gloved hand at the entire site. "The quarter section you filed is adjacent. This ruin, this fortress, is still the property of the United States War Department. You are trespassing, sir, and what's more, you're a fool to waste your time. You can't live in a bunker." Silas Putnam shifted in his saddle. "It's a tomb is what it is, Ulrich," he offered, his voice softer than Marston's, but laced with the same certainty. "No windows to speak of. Stone sweats in the winter. You'll be living in a cave of ice. It's a mad idea." Marston nodded, his point reinforced. "Every dollar you spend, every swing of that axe is a waste. The patent office will not grant you title for improving federal land. You must build on your own ground. From scratch, like every other sensible man here, cease this work. That is not a request." Ulrich Holzer looked at the land agent, then at his neighbor. He looked at the sun-warmed limestone, at the massive, silent walls that had already stood for 2 decades. His English was formal, learned from books, and he used it sparingly. "The stone is here," he said, his voice a low rumble. He turned, lifted his axe, and went back to work. The thudding resumed, a steady, defiant heartbeat on the prairie. Marston saw a stubborn squatter violating federal statute. Putnam saw a madman roofing a military bunker. What did this Bernese Steinmetz, this castle mason from the old world, understand about the physics of 5-foot limestone walls that the agents of progress and the veterans of prairie winters had missed? We dig into the lost science of frontier survival every week, uncovering the forgotten genius of ordinary people who solved extraordinary problems. The story of Ulrich Holzer is more than a tale of stubbornness. It's a masterclass in thermodynamics that modern engineering is only just rediscovering. I promise you will learn exactly how 165 pounds of limestone per cubic foot can turn a single evening fire into 2 full days of warmth. Subscribe to our channel and join a community dedicated to practical wisdom. And let us know in the comments, have you ever seen an old structure repurposed in a clever or unexpected way? Ulrich Holzer was not a farmer. He had no feel for the seasons of the soil, no instinct for judging livestock. He was not a carpenter, though his hands were strong and his axe was true. He was, to the marrow of his bones, a Steinmetz, a stonemason. He came from the canton of Bern, in Switzerland, a land where history was not written in books, but in the enduring mass of castle walls and cathedral foundations. His hands were not trained to the plow handle or the saw grip. They were trained to the facing hammer, the chisel, the plumb line. He knew the distinct gritty smell of limestone dust, the heft of a perfectly squared block, the patient, centuries-long conversation between gravity and compression. He understood that a wall was not merely a barrier, but a vessel. He had brought his wife, Anya, and their two small children, Emil and Lena, to America for the promise of land. What they found was a winter that felt like a personal malice from God. Their first cabin, built with speed and desperation in the autumn of 1878, was a model of conventional frontier design and a catastrophic failure. It was a flimsy box of green lumber and sod, a sieve for the wind. The cold that settled over Minnesota that year was a physical entity. It was a predator. Holzer remembered the small, terrible details of that suffering with a clarity that fueled his every action. He remembered setting a wooden box of nails down on the floor, only to have it ring with a sharp, crystalline chime, like a glass jar. The wood itself was frozen solid. He remembered the tin handle of the milking bucket, how it had frozen instantly to the palm of his wool mitten, tearing the fabric and the skin beneath when he pulled away. He remembered the sound of the sleigh runners on the packed snow, not a crunch or a hiss, but a high, thin, continuous shriek, as if the frozen steel were screaming. Most of all, he remembered the sight of his children. Anya had wrapped them in every blanket they owned, but still they shivered. Emil, only 6, had a cough that rattled in his small chest for 3 months. Little Lena's cheeks were raw with chapping. They lived a life huddled around the cast-iron stove, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of lethal cold. The moment the fire died down, the cold would press in from the walls, tangible and heavy. Anya would wake him in the dead of night. "Ulrich, the fire," she would whisper, and he would rise, his bones aching, to feed the insatiable iron beast. He had burned through his woodpile by February, and spent the rest of the winter trading his labor for the right to fell dead wood on his neighbor's claims. He had built what he was told to build, and it had nearly killed his family. He vowed with the quiet finality of his trade that they would never face another winter like that again. The failure of the standard frontier cabin was not a failure of effort, but a failure of physics. The settlers of Renville County were hard-working and capable, but they were fighting a war against heat loss on terms dictated by the enemy. Their cabins were built of single-layer plank or log walls, chinked with mud and moss that inevitably dried, shrank, and cracked. Every seam, every joint, every window frame was a breach in the defenses, a highway for cold air to infiltrate. The central problem was a fundamental misunderstanding of heat itself. A homesteader like Silas Putnam believed his roaring stove was heating his house. It was not. It was only heating the air inside his house. Air has a dreadfully low capacity to hold thermal energy. The moment the stove cooled, the heated air would rise, find 1,000 tiny exits through the roof and walls, and be replaced by dense, super-chilled air pouring in from below. The walls themselves remained at near ambient temperature. To lean against the inside wall of a cabin in January was to feel the cold of the prairie itself, a direct, energy-sucking contact. Life became a frantic, exhausting cycle of feeding the fire. Families measured their wealth not in dollars, but in cords of seasoned oak and maple. A standard cabin might consume a cord of wood every 10 days in a cold snap, a staggering amount of fuel that required immense labor to cut, split, and haul. The result was an interior environment of violent temperature swings. One moment you were sweating if you stood too near the stove. The next, a cup of water left on a table across the room would freeze solid. It was a battle they could never win, only survive. The relentless burning of wood was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The effort was constant, the progress negligible. Ulrich Holzer, the Steinmetz, understood the flaw instinctively. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the bucket. A proper house, a house built to master the cold, did not just contain warm air. It had to become warm itself. It needed mass. It needed the thermal inertia that he had known his entire life, the deep, abiding memory for warmth that resided only in stone. As summer waned and the first hints of autumn crisped the morning air, Holzer's project took shape. He ignored Marston's repeated warnings, delivered now with official-looking letters from the land office, which Anya used to help start the evening fire. His work was a study in methodical patience. He had not built the walls, he had inherited them. His task was to honor their strength. He spent weeks clearing the interior of the powder magazine, removing the rubble and debris of a dozen years of neglect. He examined every inch of the original masonry, the work of U.S. Army engineers. The cut limestone blocks were fitted with a precision he deeply respected. He spent a month re-chinking the mortar, using a mix of local clay, sand, and lime that he prepared himself, ensuring the vast stone structure was airtight. His primary labor was the roof. On the top course of the stone walls, he mortared heavy anchor bolts, then hoisted the massive hewn rafters into place one by one, using a simple gin pole and the patient strength of his horse. He constructed a hip roof, a design with 4 sloping sides, knowing it was inherently stronger against the shearing winds of the prairie than a simple gable. He sheathed it with thick planking and then, over the course of 2 weeks, laid a pristine roof of cedar shingles, each one positioned with the care of a watchmaker. His final, most crucial task was the hearth. He chose the north wall, the side that would bear the brunt of the winter winds. He carefully dismantled a section of the interior stone, going only about a foot deep into the 5-foot wall. Here, he built his fireplace and chimney, using field stone he gathered from his own claim. The design was masterful. The flue snaked upwards inside the massive limestone wall. This meant the hot smoke and gases from the fire would not just exit into the sky. They would first heat the very core of the north wall. He was not just installing a fireplace, he was plugging a furnace directly into the heart of a 300-ton stone battery. Theron Marston made one last visit in late October, as the trees along the river turned to gold. He carried a formal notice of trespass, giving Holzer 30 days to vacate the premises. "Holzer, this is your final warning," Marston said, his voice devoid of its earlier anger, replaced now by a weary resignation. "The department is prepared to remove you by force. I don't want to see it come to that. A man with a wife and children. For God's sake, abandon this folly. You will lose everything you've put into it. The government does not reward squatters." Ulrich Holzer was fitting a simple wooden door to its frame. He paused and looked at the land agent. He gestured to the silent, solid walls around him, to the tight roof above, to the massive stone hearth. "Mr. Marston," he said calmly, "the winter is coming. My family will be warm." He returned to his work, leaving the land agent standing alone with his useless paper. What Ulrich Holzer understood was a principle of physics so profound and so elegant that it bordered on magic: thermal mass. To Theron Marston and Silas Putnam, the 5-foot-thick limestone walls were a liability, heavy, cold, and immovable. To Holzer, they were a reservoir. The science begins with 2 numbers. The first is specific heat capacity. This is the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of a material. Water has a high specific heat. It takes a lot of energy to heat it up, which is why a pot of water takes time to boil. The limestone of the fort walls had a specific heat of 0.21 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. This is less than water, but far greater than air. The second number is density. The cut limestone was incredibly dense, weighing 165 pounds per cubic foot. A cubic foot of air, by contrast, weighs less than a tenth of a pound. Combining these two properties, moderate specific heat and immense density, created the potential for a massive thermal battery. Let's consider just one linear foot of Holzer's wall. At 8 feet high and 5 feet thick, that single foot of wall contained 40 cubic feet of stone. Multiplying that by the density gives a weight of 6,600 pounds. To raise the temperature of that single, 1 foot long section of wall by 1 degree Fahrenheit required over 1,300 BTUs of energy. A BTU, or British thermal unit, is roughly the amount of heat produced by a single kitchen match. Holzer's home had approximately 120 linear feet of exterior wall. The total weight of the limestone was nearly 800,000 pounds, or 400 tons. To heat that entire mass by 20 degrees would require millions of BTUs. This is where the hearth came in. A modest evening fire, burning for 3 or 4 hours, releases a tremendous amount of energy. In a conventional cabin, 90% of that energy goes straight up the chimney. But in Holzer's design, a significant portion of that heat was absorbed directly by the stone of the north wall, conducted slowly from block to block. This created the crucial effect: thermal lag. The heat didn't vanish. It soaked into the stone, migrating through the 5-foot thickness at a crawl. As the fire died down and the air in the room began to cool, the process would reverse. The immense reservoir of heat stored in the walls would begin to flow back out, radiating gently into the living space. The walls had become the stove. They smoothed out the wild temperature swings of the prairie winter, absorbing energy when it was abundant during the fire, and releasing it slowly and steadily when it was scarce, through the long, cold night and the following day. Holzer wasn't fighting the cold with a frantic, roaring fire. He was taming it with the slow, geologic patience of stone. He had built a home that possessed a memory of warmth. That November, the winter came not as a gradual cooling, but as an invasion. A titanic mass of Arctic air, a polar vortex, descended from the high latitudes and squatted over Minnesota, holding the landscape in a frozen siege. For 21 consecutive nights, the temperature in Renville County plunged to 41 degrees below zero. A brittle, windless cold settled in. The sun, when it appeared, was a pale, useless disk in the sky. In the settlement, the thin plumes of smoke from every chimney told a story of desperation. The smoke itself seemed to freeze. As the water vapor hit the super-chilled air, it condensed and crystallized instantly, building up on the roofs around the chimney pipes. By the end of the first week, every cabin and house wore a bizarre crown of 4-inch, needle-like frost crystals, a delicate and terrifying monument to the sheer volume of heat being lost to the sky. Inside those homes, life ground to a miserable halt. Families lived in a single room, draped in coats and blankets. The frost crept across the window panes, then across the walls themselves, a creeping tide of white. Inside Ulrich Holzer's stone house, a different reality prevailed. The first night the temperature plunged, Ulrich built a strong, steady fire in his new hearth. The flames licked the fieldstone, and the smoke snaked up the flue, warming the core of the great north wall. He banked the coals before bed, and the family slept under simple wool blankets. The next day, there was no fire. The air outside was a painful, searing cold, but inside the stone walls, a gentle, even warmth radiated from all sides. It was a silent, motionless heat, the kind you feel but cannot source. Anya baked bread, the yeasty smell filling the single large room. Emil and Lena, in their shirt sleeves, drew pictures on a slate tablet on the floor, a floor that was cool but not cold. There were no drafts. A candle flame on the table stood perfectly erect, unshaken by any infiltration of outside air. As a quiet experiment, Anya took a small pat of butter from their churn and left it on the deep interior sill of a small window Holzer had cut in the south wall. In any other house, it would have been as hard as a rock in minutes. Here, it remained soft, yielding, and ready to spread. They burned one fire in the evening for a few hours. That was all. Their woodpile, stacked neatly against the east wall, seemed almost untouched. Theron Marston held out until the third week of the cold snap. His own office was an icebox, his inkwell frozen solid every morning. His frustration with the stubborn Swiss squatter had hardened into a cold resolve. The law was the law, and the winter was no excuse for anarchy. Bundling himself in a buffalo coat, he saddled his horse and set out for the fort ruins to deliver the eviction notice in person and see that its terms were obeyed. The ride was brutal. The air was so cold it felt like shattered glass in his lungs. His horse's breath froze instantly on its muzzle. By the time he saw the low, solid shape of Holzer's roofed ruin, the sun was setting, and the temperature was plummeting once more. He knew he couldn't make it back to town. He would have to ask the squatter for shelter for the night before evicting him in the morning. The irony was not lost on him. Holzer met him at the door and, seeing the state of the man and his horse, simply nodded and gestured him inside. Anya gave him a bowl of hot soup. The place was astonishing. A small, pleasant fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth in the room was something else entirely. It was a pervasive, gentle presence, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the very stones. Marston, huddled in his greatcoat, slowly began to thaw. He saw the two children playing on the floor, looking healthy and comfortable. He saw no signs of hardship. Holzer offered him a bedroll near the fire. Marston, exhausted, accepted. He lay down fully dressed, his greatcoat pulled up to his chin, expecting the familiar, miserable routine of a frontier night, the slow, creeping chill as the fire died, the waking at 3 a.m. to a bone-deep cold, the desperate wait for dawn. He woke with a start. It was pitch black, but he was not cold. He was hot. He was sweating profusely inside his coat. Confused, he sat up. The fire in the hearth was nothing but a bed of glowing red embers. The room should have been freezing, yet it was profoundly, comfortably warm. He pushed off his greatcoat, feeling the incredible relief of the cool air on his damp shirt. He stood and walked, in his stocking feet, across the stone floor. It was not warm, but it held no chill. On impulse, he reached out and placed his bare palm flat against the inner surface of the south wall, the wall furthest from the fire. The sensation was the death of his certainty. He had expected the slick, biting cold of stone in winter, a cold that felt like it was actively pulling the life from his hand. What he felt instead was a distinct, undeniable, living warmth. It was subtle, but it was absolute. The wall itself was breathing heat. His eyes, adjusting to the gloom, fell upon a small black object on the windowsill. It was a cast-iron pot. He walked over to it. It was the pot from which Anya had served a side dish of fried potatoes with their dinner, a Swiss dish she called roosty. Curious, he touched its side. It was still warm to the touch. He dipped a finger into the pot. The cooking oil in the bottom was not just liquid. It was warm. He thought of his own pantry, where the sacks of potatoes were frozen as solid as billiard balls. In this house, Tories, potatoes left on a windowsill overnight were still warm enough to eat. At that moment, Theron Marston understood. He was not standing in a house. He was standing inside a piece of geology, a man-made extension of the Earth's thermal mass. When dawn broke, pale and frigid, Marston went outside. Holzer was already there, calmly splitting oak rounds for the next evening's fire, his breath pluming in the still air. Marston walked over. the official eviction notice a crisp, useless rectangle in his coat pocket. He looked at Holzer, at the quiet stone house, and at his own horse, which stood coated in a thick layer of frost, shivering miserably. He did not apologize. He did not admit he was wrong. Land agents did not do such things. Instead, he asked a practical question. "Holzer," he said, his voice raspy, "how many cords of wood have you burned this month?" Ulrich thought for a moment. "Perhaps 2, he said. Marston stared. 2 cords. He himself had burned through 4 at his small office and had been cold the entire time. He looked at the house again, then back at the quiet Swiss man. The narrator's voice reflects on the moment. Marston realized Holzer hadn't built a house. He had built a season. Without another word, Theron Marston turned, mounted his horse, and rode back to New Ulm, the eviction notice still folded in his pocket. Marston's official report to the land office was a masterpiece of bureaucratic invention. He made no mention of trespass. Instead, he described Holzer's work as a private stabilization of a deteriorating federal military asset, arguing that the homesteader had, at his own expense, prevented a historic structure from collapsing, thereby saving the government money. The argument was flimsy, but in the face of the ongoing brutal winter, no one was eager to question a success. The story, however, began to travel. It was too strange, too dramatic to remain quiet. It reached the ears of a surveyor for the Minnesota Historical Society, a man tasked with documenting the state's pioneer heritage for a quarterly publication called Pioneer Memorials. Intrigued, he made the journey to Renville County in February. He spent 2 days with the Holzers, measuring the walls, sketching the roof design, recording temperature differentials with his own thermometer, and documenting Ulrich's fuel consumption. The result appeared in the March 1880 issue, a 3-page article, complete with diagrams, titled "A Novel Application of Military Masonry for Domestic Habitation." It detailed the Holzer method, presenting it not as folklore, but as a sound engineering principle. The article circulated among the land-hungry and winter-weary settlers of southern Minnesota. By the following autumn, the War Department had received 6 formal petitions from families in neighboring Sibley County, where the ruins of Fort Cox lay moldering. They cited the Historical Society article and requested permission to reclaim the abandoned government stone for their own homes. The idea had begun its spread, not as a whispered rumor, but as a documented and repeatable piece of practical science. Ulrich Holzer, the castle mason from Bern, had done more than build a warm house. With the tools of a trade that was already ancient, he had perfectly anticipated the principles of modern building science. Decades before architects and engineers would give them names, he had built a functional trombe wall, a passive solar heat sink, and a high-mass thermal storage system. His simple, powerful design demonstrated a truth that we are still rediscovering today, that the most elegant solutions are often not about adding more power, but about intelligently conserving the energy you already have. His stone fortress was a machine for living, a century ahead of its time. The powder magazine at Fort Ridgely had been built for a single, violent purpose: to contain an explosion, to absorb and smother a blast of instantaneous, destructive heat. Its 5-foot walls were an architecture of war, designed to stand against a moment of extreme violence. They were a vessel of contained force. Ulrich Holzer looked at those walls and saw not their past, but a different future. He saw in their immense, silent mass a different kind of strength, the capacity to absorb not the heat of gunpowder, but the gentle warmth of a winter fire, and to hold it against the long, cold siege of a Minnesota night. He didn't build a wall against the weather. He taught a wall built for war to stand against winter instead. He turned an architecture of fear into an architecture of survival. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you believe, as we do, that these stories of ingenuity hold valuable lessons for our own time, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video. It helps us to continue our research and bring more of these forgotten histories to light. Our question for you this week: what is the most clever example of energy efficiency, old or new, that you've ever encountered? We look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments below. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. However, the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and engineering. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.